The Arctic night was endless. The horizon blurred into ice and sky, the wind cutting across frozen ridges at 70 below zero. Somewhere on that vast sheet of drifting ice sat the ghost of a Soviet research station, abandoned in haste, its radios silent, its towers still braced against the storm. To the Central Intelligence Agency, that frozen husk was treasure. They believed the Soviets had left behind equipment that revealed how Moscow tracked American submarines under the polar ice. Into this wasteland, in May 1962, 2 Americans fell from the sky. Parachutes bloomed against the white void as Major James Smith of the U.S. Air Force and Lieutenant Leonard Leshak, a naval officer turned CIA consultant, dropped onto the ice. They carried no way home, no runway, no chance of walking out. Their only lifeline was a plan so audacious it bordered on suicidal. They would search the abandoned Soviet base, gather everything of value, and then stand on the ice to be plucked from the earth by a passing aircraft using a wire, a balloon, and a hook mounted on its nose. A system so untested that even its inventor admitted it was as likely to kill as to save. The mission was called Project COLDFEET. If it failed, 2 men would vanish into the Arctic, and the Soviets would claim the bodies. If it succeeded, Washington would gain insights into Moscow's most secret polar surveillance technology. Hello there. If this brief is useful, like the video, so this series reaches more people who care about real records, not rumors. Subscribe for more declassified stories. The early 1960s were the height of Cold War anxiety, and nowhere was the frontier more uncertain than the Arctic. Beneath its drifting ice sheets and sub-zero waters lay the shortest path for intercontinental ballistic missiles between the United States and the Soviet Union. It was the great circle of death. If nuclear war came, the polar route was where missiles and bombers would fly. But the Arctic was not only an avenue of attack, it was also a hiding place. Submarines, particularly the new nuclear-powered boats, could slip under the ice, invisible to satellites or surface patrols, able to launch missiles from positions that radar could not track. Both Washington and Moscow wanted the Arctic because whoever controlled it could threaten the other with stealth and surprise. The Soviets had invested heavily in Arctic science, establishing drifting research stations across the polar pack ice. Crewed by scientists and often guarded by military officers, these stations studied everything from meteorology to ocean currents to acoustic properties under the ice. For the CIA, such science was never neutral. The agency suspected the Soviets were using their stations to develop methods of detecting American submarines beneath the Arctic, technologies that could neutralize the U.S. nuclear deterrent. In early 1962, word reached Langley that one such Soviet station, codenamed NP-8, had been abandoned. It had drifted dangerously close to a fissure in the ice, forcing evacuation. Helicopters lifted out the Soviet personnel, leaving behind instruments, records, and possibly classified gear. For the CIA, this was opportunity. Here was a Soviet military scientific facility, intact but deserted, hundreds of miles from the nearest observers. If someone could reach it, they might recover data that revealed Soviet under-ice detection methods, radio systems, and even documents. The challenge was, how? NP-8 was in the middle of nowhere. No airstrips, no supply lines, no safe landing zones. Even ski-equipped aircraft risked crashing on the uneven ice. Helicopters lacked the range. The only plausible way in was parachute, but dropping men into the Arctic meant leaving them stranded. Once down, they could not walk out or call for rescue. They needed an extraction system that worked without runways, without landing. A system that could snatch men and cargo off the ice and haul them into the sky. At the same time, in a quiet corner of U.S. Air Force testing, such a system was being trialed. The Fulton Skyhook, developed by inventor Robert Fulton Jr. It used a helium balloon attached to a lift line, an aircraft equipped with a special nose-mounted yoke, would fly low, snag the line, and reel the person or cargo aboard by winch. It was ingenious and terrifying. The test dummies often whipped violently through the air. Even when human trials began, the margin of error was razor thin. One mistake in timing or equipment failure could snap necks or fling men into the ocean. Still, the CIA saw in it the perfect solution. Drop men in, let them comb through the Soviet station, then send a plane to hook them out, along with whatever crates of intelligence they had salvaged. No runways, no landings, just a wire, a balloon, and courage. 2 men were chosen: Lieutenant Leonard Leshak, a Navy officer trained in polar science, who spoke Russian and had experience in Arctic conditions; Major James Smith, an Air Force officer skilled in parachuting and survival. Together, they would form a 2-man CIA USAF team, parachute into NP-8, and trust their lives to a Skyhook extraction. In May 1962, as NP-8 drifted across the ice floes of the high Arctic, the operation was authorized. It was given a code name fitting for its audacity and environment: Project COLDFEET. The Arctic was no ordinary battlefield. At 70 below, the ice itself became a weapon. Skin froze in seconds. Metal snapped like glass. The wind erased tracks and toppled tents. For Leshak and Smith, survival was not just about completing their mission, but about enduring the environment long enough to be retrieved. The CIA and Air Force knew this, and every step of preparation was shaped by the reality of ice and silence. Training began with parachuting. Though both men were experienced jumpers, the Arctic demanded a different discipline. Parachutes could stiffen in the cold, risers could freeze solid, and the surface below was not earth, but a shifting quilt of ice ridges and leads of open water. They practiced landings into mock fields of broken ice, rehearsing how to gather gear fast, how to avoid slipping into crevasses, how to anchor themselves before the wind could drag parachutes across the floes. Survival drills followed. The men were taught to build windbreaks from snow, to use stoves sparingly so as not to melt unstable ice, to ration food in case extraction failed. Their packs contained Arctic-rated sleeping bags, emergency beacons, and sleds to drag equipment salvaged from the Soviet station. Yet both knew that much of survival would come down to improvisation. The most radical preparation, however, was for extraction. The Fulton Skyhook system was still a prototype. The principle was deceptively simple. A helium balloon lifted a nylon line high into the air. A low-flying aircraft, modified with a steel V-shaped yoke on its nose, would snag the line at speed. The person or cargo at the other end would be ripped from the ground, jerked into the sky, and then reeled aboard via a winch. It was a violent maneuver. In tests, dummies often cartwheeled wildly, slamming into the fuselage. Early trials with sheep and pigs produced mixed results. Human trials worked, but left men bruised and shaken. Still, by 1962, the system had matured enough for daring use. The CIA chose a platform for it: a B-17 Flying Fortress, a bomber from World War II, repurposed for covert work. The aircraft was stripped, refitted with the Skyhook yoke, and modified with winches strong enough to haul a man or crate aboard. The old bomber was chosen not for nostalgia, but for practicality. It had long range, could operate from rough runways, and its slower speed gave pilots more control during the snatch maneuver. Crews practiced relentlessly. Pilots flew low passes over test fields, snagging dummies, while gunners turned crewmen worked the winch. The timing had to be perfect. Too low and the plane risked crashing into the ice. Too high and the line could snap. Every successful catch built confidence, but the margin for error remained hair-thin. Leshak and Smith rehearsed with the system themselves. They were strapped into harnesses, dragged skyward, spun through freezing winds, then reeled aboard. It was brutal and disorienting, but it worked. The men emerged, convinced that while the Skyhook was terrifying, it was survivable. Meanwhile, intelligence officers studied what might await them at NP-8. Satellite photography was primitive, but reconnaissance flights suggested intact structures, huts, antenna masts, instrument towers. The Soviets had likely evacuated in haste, leaving behind bulky gear too difficult to airlift. Analysts speculated about acoustic sensors, hydrophones, and radio systems, the kind of equipment that could reveal how the Soviets tracked submarines under ice. To bring back such hardware, Leshak and Smith carried sleds and crates. The plan was to gather as much as they could drag, secure it into bundles, and send it skyward on separate Skyhook lifts before their own extraction. Each load would be tagged with orange balloons, a surreal sight against the endless white, ready to be plucked by the waiting B-17. The final weeks before deployment were spent acclimatizing. The men slept in cold chambers, testing gear under simulated Arctic winds. They learned to use Soviet equipment manuals, studied Russian labeling, and rehearsed dismantling radio gear. Every hour of preparation was meant to reduce the time on ice. The longer they stayed, the greater the risk of Soviet aircraft spotting them or the ice shifting beneath their camp. By late May 1962, the mission was ready. The B-17 was flown north. Its crew briefed on the most unusual retrieval in Air Force history. Leshak and Smith checked their parachutes one last time. Ahead of them lay a Soviet ghost station, a sea of ice, and the most dangerous hook in the sky. On May 28, 1962, the Arctic was an unbroken plain of white when the transport plane roared overhead and two parachutes bloomed against the sky. Major James Smith and Lieutenant Leonard Leshak drifted down into silence, the air so cold it bit through their gear, the ice groaning beneath them like an endless living thing. The station NP-8 lay half buried in snow, its radio masts bent, its prefabricated huts creaking in the wind. No voices, no footprints, no life, just the remains of a Soviet presence, abandoned to the elements. Their landing was rough. The parachutes dragged across jagged ice ridges. Before collapsing in the wind, they gathered their gear quickly, sleds, tools, survival kits, and began the short trek to the station. The structures loomed ahead, a frozen outpost of the Soviet Union in one of the loneliest places on Earth. Inside the huts, the two men found what they had come for: equipment left behind in haste, hydrophones designed to listen under ice, generators, and most importantly, documents and notebooks that revealed Soviet acoustic experiments. Charts detailed how sound traveled beneath Arctic ice layers, how currents distorted sonar, how submarines could be detected by long-range listening. For Washington, this was confirmation that the Soviets were working aggressively to track American nuclear submarines in the polar seas. Leshak and Smith worked quickly, their breath freezing in clouds, their hands numbed through thick gloves. They packed crates with radios, recording devices, and piles of notebooks scribbled in Russian. Each load was lashed to sleds, dragged into the open, and secured for later extraction. The station yielded more than they hoped, proof that Moscow had invested heavily in Arctic surveillance, and clues that its capabilities were growing. But the clock was ticking. They could not linger. The ice could shift, cracks could open, and the Soviets might return at any time to scavenge their own base. After 2 days of collecting, they radioed their coordinates. High above, the B-17 circled, waiting for the weather to clear for the Skyhook runs. The first extraction was not a man, but a crate. A helium balloon was filled, lifting a nylon line straight into the gray sky. The load was attached at the base. From the horizon, the B-17 approached at low altitude, its V-shaped nose yoke gleaming. The crew leaned forward, eyes locked on the balloon. At precisely the right moment, the plane roared overhead, snagged the line, and yanked the crate into the air. It snapped upward, jerking violently, then steadied as the winch crew reeled it aboard. Against all odds, the first load was secured. More followed. Each time, the balloon rose into the Arctic sky. The B-17 swooped in, and another bundle of Soviet secrets was snatched into flight. The system was brutal, dangerous, but it worked. Finally came the turn of the men. Smith went first. He strapped into the harness, checked his gear, and watched as the balloon drifted upward, a lone signal against the vast emptiness. When the B-17 bore down, the tension was unbearable. The hook struck the line, the nylon tightened, and Smith was ripped from the ice like a rag doll. He spun wildly, the cold wind screaming past his face, before the winch crew hauled him into the belly of the bomber, bruised, shaken, but alive. Then it was Leschak's turn. He stood on the ice, balloon line tethered, eyes fixed on the approaching bomber. The roar grew deafening. At the moment of impact, the line snapped taut, and he was lifted violently off the ice, his body lashing against the Arctic wind. He dangled for minutes as the winch dragged him closer, every second an eternity. At last, he was pulled into the aircraft, collapsed on the floor, grinning in disbelief. The mission had worked. Against every danger, the ice, the cold, the Soviets, and the Skyhook itself, they had survived. With them came crates of equipment and documents that would change how the U.S. understood Soviet Arctic strategy. In the quiet of the bomber's cabin, as the B-17 turned south toward home, Leshak and Smith finally let themselves breathe. They had parachuted into the end of the world and left it with Moscow's secrets strapped in crates beside them. Project COLDFEET had succeeded. Back in the United States, the crates from the ice station were whisked into secure facilities where CIA analysts and Navy experts began cataloging the haul. What they found confirmed suspicions and exceeded expectations. The Soviets had been running acoustic detection experiments across the Arctic, placing hydrophones beneath the ice to study how sound traveled through polar waters. Diagrams showed how low-frequency sound could carry extraordinary distances under the pack ice, bouncing between layers in ways that made submarines detectable from afar. One set of notebooks revealed Soviet trials using explosives as sound sources, detonating charges to create acoustic profiles. Other equipment hinted at long-term monitoring of U.S. submarine patrols. For Washington, this was a wake-up call. The Arctic, long thought to be an American advantage because of geography, was not immune to Soviet eyes and ears. The Navy realized its submarines slipping under the pole were not as invisible as once believed. The haul from COLDFEET fed into planning sessions at the Pentagon, influencing where submarines patrolled and how sonar countermeasures were developed. Economically, the operation cost little compared to the payoff. 2 men parachuted in, 1 B-17 bomber, refitted with a Skyhook, a handful of support flights, and in return, the U.S. had captured years of Soviet research. The balance sheet was staggering. In intelligence terms, it was one of the cheapest and richest covert operations of the decade. Politically, COLDFEET had to be handled with delicacy. Washington could not boast openly. To do so would reveal the Skyhook system and humiliate Moscow in a way that might provoke retaliation. The mission was buried in classified reports, its lessons folded quietly into Arctic defense planning. Only a few senior officials were fully briefed. President John F. Kennedy was told in summary that the U.S. had gained valuable insights into Soviet under-ice detection. The full details remained locked inside CIA files. For the Soviets, the discovery of their abandoned gear's disappearance came slowly. Months after evacuation, when recovery teams attempted to return to NP-8, they found little left. Equipment had vanished, footprints long erased by the wind. Internal memos within Soviet Naval Command reflected confusion. Had the Americans risked an operation on the drifting ice? Some officers argued it was impossible. Others warned that nothing was impossible to the CIA. In Moscow, the absence of proof meant the incident never reached the level of international scandal. But within the Soviet military, COLDFEET reinforced paranoia. Budgets for Arctic research grew. New drifting stations were planned with tighter control of evacuation procedures. Crews were ordered to destroy sensitive equipment before abandoning any base. The lesson for Moscow was bitter. Even in the most remote corners of the planet, the Americans would come. For the CIA, COLDFEET was more than a technical win. It was symbolic. At a time when the Bay of Pigs disaster had tarnished its reputation, here was proof that daring and imagination could deliver. Parachuting 2 men into the Arctic, then plucking them back into the sky, was a feat that restored confidence within the agency. It showed that unconventional methods, the kind that seemed reckless on paper, could yield breakthroughs. The operation also gave new momentum to the Fulton Skyhook system itself. What had been a fragile prototype was now combat-tested. The success of COLDFEET convinced the Air Force and CIA to retain Skyhook for future use. For decades afterward, the system remained on the books, a last resort tool for rescuing agents from denied areas. In short, COLDFEET was a bargain. A few days on the ice had shifted us understanding of Soviet Arctic power and reinforced the idea that the Cold War could be fought and won in the strangest and harshest places on Earth. Project COLDFEET had delivered beyond expectation, but it also exposed just how fragile such an operation really was. For all the triumph of parachuting 2 men into the Arctic and pulling them out by Skyhook, the mission balanced on a knife's edge. One gust of wind, one misstep on the ice, one mechanical failure in the B-17, and the story would have ended in disaster. The Skyhook itself remained the greatest point of vulnerability. Tests before COLDFEET had shown its violence. In some trials, the lift line snapped, sending dummies crashing back to Earth. In others, the snatched load whipped violently, slamming against the aircraft fuselage. Even during COLDFEET, when Smith and Leschak were pulled from the ice, both men were hurled through the air with such force that the winch crew feared their harnesses might tear. A single broken strap would have meant death. Pilots, too, bore enormous risk. Flying low over the Arctic ice at precise speed and altitude left no room for error. Turbulence, ice fog, or a misjudged approach could have torn the Skyhook off the plane or ripped the nose apart. The old B-17 was rugged, but its engines strained in the freezing air, and its cockpit instruments were never designed for precision maneuvers in polar whiteouts. Logistically, COLDFEET could not be scaled. Dropping 2 men into one abandoned Soviet station was feasible, but to repeat the operation at multiple sites would require multiple crews trained in Skyhook, more retrofitted bombers, and men willing to parachute into lethal ice flows. The cost-benefit ratio, once the Soviets began destroying sensitive equipment before evacuation, tilted steeply against trying again. Politically, the mission's secrecy also limited repetition. If COLDFEET had gone wrong, the fallout would have been enormous. Moscow would have trumpeted the capture or death of American agents on Soviet territory, framing it as proof of U.S. aggression. In 1962, with the Cuban Missile Crisis looming that same year, such an incident could have pushed the superpowers to the brink. Inside Langley, cooler heads acknowledged that COLDFEET had been a bold gamble, not a sustainable program. Even within the CIA and Air Force, the operation left scars of unease. Afterward, officers admitted privately that the mission had succeeded as much through luck as planning. The Arctic weather had held just long enough. The ice had not broken beneath the camp. The Soviet patrols had not stumbled upon NP-8 in time. For an agency that prided itself on minimizing risk, COLDFEET was an uncomfortable reminder that sometimes victory came at the edge of recklessness. The program's collapse was not from failure, but from caution. After COLDFEET, Skyhook remained in the CIA toolkit, but was rarely used. Training continued. Later, in Vietnam, Laos, and even Alaska, the system was tested or deployed for emergency extractions, but no other mission matched the scale or audacity of COLDFEET. It remained a singular achievement, a Cold War story too dangerous to repeat. Yet the symbolic power of the mission endured. COLDFEET showed that the Cold War was not fought only in embassies and capitals, but also on drifting ice floes at the top of the world. It revealed that imagination, as much as firepower, could shift the balance. And it reminded those who planned future operations that the line between daring and disaster is always paper-thin. When the B-17 landed safely in Alaska with Smith, Leshak, and their crates of Soviet gear aboard, the mission was declared a success. Few beyond the CIA and Air Force ever heard the full story. In the immediate aftermath, reports were stamped top secret and locked away in classified archives. The world knew nothing. Inside Langley, however, COLDFEET was celebrated quietly. Analysts pored over the equipment and notebooks, feeding their findings into assessments of Soviet under-ice detection. For the U.S. Navy, it was proof that Soviet science was more advanced than expected, but also confirmation that their methods had limits. American submarines would have to adapt, but the threat was understood. Knowledge meant survivability. For the men themselves, the memory never faded. Leshak later described standing alone on the ice as the balloon rose, and the roar of the B-17 bore down on him. The moment when he realized that if anything failed, his story would end there in the frozen Arctic. Smith spoke of the violence of the Skyhook snatch, how his body spun so hard he thought the harness would break. Both men lived, but both admitted they had felt their lives reduced to a wire, a hook, and luck. The Fulton Skyhook system, though never widely adopted, became legend. For decades, it remained a quiet option in the CIA's playbook, a method reserved for the most desperate situations. Later, it was showcased in training films and eventually entered popular imagination. In the 2008 Batman movie The Dark Knight, when Bruce Wayne extracts a man from Hong Kong with a balloon and plane, that was Skyhook, the COLDFEET legacy, turned cinematic. In CIA history, COLDFEET is remembered as one of the most audacious small-team operations of the Cold War. 2 men, an abandoned Soviet base, and a retrieval system so strange it bordered on science fiction. Unlike the sprawling covert wars in Cuba or Southeast Asia, COLDFEET was minimalist. A parachute in, a balloon out, and crates of secrets in between. Declassified in fragments during the 1990s, the mission astonished readers who first learned that American officers had dropped onto Soviet ice and been yanked into the sky by a hook on a bomber. Some dismissed it as too outlandish to be real, yet the files told the truth. The mission had happened, and it had worked. For historians, COLDFEET represents the essence of Cold War espionage: imagination over firepower, desperation over safety, daring over reason. It also underscores the fragility of operations at the edge of the world. One crack in the ice, one slip of timing, and the story would be one of tragedy instead of triumph. Today, the Arctic is again contested, a new frontier for submarines, bombers, and satellites. But the ghost of COLDFEET remains. In the drifting winds over the polar ice, one can still picture 2 parachutes falling toward an abandoned Soviet station, and later, 2 men ripped from the ice into the belly of an old bomber, carrying with them the secrets of an empire. Project COLDFEET endures as a reminder that in the Cold War, even the frozen silence of the Arctic was not beyond reach.